Our world is welcoming the birth of the 7 billionth living human. But is this good news or bad news?
Maybe a disastrous thing for the Earth.
In some cases it's good, in some cases it's bad.
Our world is growing at an unprecedented pace. From 3 billion people in 1959 to 7 billion people just 52 years later. From education and healthcare to unemployment and the environment. Lifestyles travels the world asking experts the question, can our world cope? An in-depth look at how our world's ever-growing population is affecting our daily lives, only on CNC World.
The world's population hit 7 billion people on October 31st, 2011. Today, the global population is double that of just 50 years ago, and that has many people asking, can we cope?
But today, this day of 7 billion is not about one newborn or even one generation. This is a day about our entire human family.
Poverty, lack of access to health care and education, crumbling infrastructure, and the destruction of our environment and more are already challenges. So if we're struggling today, can we as a world community care for even more neighbors? To find out, we've traveled the world asking experts for their predictions and advice. Our first stop, Serbia, the home of the world's 6 billionth person. On October 12, 1999, 2 minutes past midnight, Adnan Mevic was welcomed to the world.
Healthy male baby, 3.5 kilogram weight, 52 centimeter height.
His family in Serbia couldn't have been happier. Adnan was their first and only child.
I am a happy mother. I couldn't wait to have a baby.
The world also celebrated Adnan's arrival because he became Earth's 6 billionth resident.
Here in Sarajevo is the symbol of hope, 6 billionth human being and the world.
Today, Adnan is a 7th grader in Belgrade, and we caught up with him and his still glowing parents. Amazingly, just 12 years after Adnan's historic birth, the world is marking another population milestone. The 7 billionth living human being has been born. So how did our population grow so much, so fast? According to the United Nations, to get to 7 billion people, it took 227,000 babies being born every single day. That's 158 newborns each second. Astonishing when you consider that the world's population didn't even reach 1 billion until 1804. It took 123 years to hit the 2 billion mark in 1927. Then the population pace hit full speed. 3 billion in 1959, 4 billion in 1974, 5 billion in 1987, and 6 billion in 1999. Today, the UN estimates the world's population grows by some 83 million people each year. So many that if each newborn were placed side by side, they would circle the Earth 3.5 times. 60% of people today live in Asia, but the impact of their existence is felt around the world. And depending on who you ask, they're either an asset or a major problem.
Well, 7 billion is quite a maybe a disastrous thing for the Earth. Okay, so I should just...
Robert Wyman, a developmental biology professor at Yale University in the United States, actually says 7 billion people is a very, very scary scenario, especially if the current birth rate continues.
And which we mean the number.
According to the UN, if the current fertility rate were to remain constant around the world, the population could reach nearly 27 billion by the end of this century. The best way to prevent that from happening is to slow down the number of annual births. In fact, the UN says if women had just one less child in their lifetime, the world's population at the end of the century could be 6.2 billion, a decline from our current population. But not everyone sees this growth as negatively as Dr. Wyman.
In a way, it's a good news because, the population growth is the result of the difference between death rates and birth rates. Population growth can trigger technological innovations. So in some cases it's good, in some cases it's bad.
It may not be bad news per se, because the population is growing in most parts of the world, especially in the developing world, whereby the growth rate is high. But there are issues to do with how do you cater for that population in terms of having resources that can enable the population utilize those resources for better life.
That concern has been around for centuries. In fact, well-known population expert Thomas Malthus published a series of essays on the effects of population growth until his death in 1834. Malthus warned that the increase in population would eventually lead to a world that couldn't feed itself because of lack of land for crops. Today, the developing world does struggle to feed its people, as evidenced by the recent famine in the Horn of Africa.
You can boom for a while, but you can eat yourself out of your own survival and expect a crash later on of population.
But what Malthus didn't predict were the advancements in science and technology, which have helped the world increase food production, and the increase in migration from areas with fewer resources to those rich in resources. Take China, for example. It is now the world's most populated country. In the last 10 years alone, some 260 million people have left rural, less developed areas of the country and settled in large cities, seeking a better life. And until the country can offer people in those areas a similar standard of living, the number of migrants is expected to increase.
It's a shame because the people in developing countries really would prefer to stay home. You're always more comfortable at home, but conditions are just so crowded, so impossible there that they're not able to. And they're showing it.
People in China and countries around the world are not only moving within their home country in search of quality of life, they are willing to immigrate to foreign countries, despite the fact that they have to leave everyone and everything they've ever known.
First of all, they are very lonely. They're isolated. They are very small families that they have to strike just to survive in this new country.
Mary Kam works for one of the many immigrant settlement programs operating in Canada, one of the world's most popular destinations for immigrants. According to the country's 2007 census, a vast majority of its 1.6 million new residents between 2001 and 2006 were immigrants.
We have a back home is farmer, and farmer, they work so hard in the farm and the life, and then we came to Canada. We got a job here, little job. We were working in the machine shop. Then I choose to start my business. Since when I start my business, I got my own freedom. And India, it might be a little bit hard to start business in those days.
In Canada, it seems that immigration is a win-win. The reason, because of the country's current low birth rate, immigrants are becoming more and more essential to Canada's workforce. In fact, between now and 2030, Canada says it will rely on immigrants as its major source of population growth. But not every country is excited about foreign population growth.
But how many can we take? If our borders were open, vast numbers of Chinese would want to come, vast numbers of Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and so on. And they're all individually wonderful people, easily as just they're not different than Americans. They're fine. But they may be poor and uneducated, and how much can we take? And the same is true for Europe or Australia and any of these places. So that's a very big problem.
A big problem that has led to major conflicts.
A man who disguised in a police uniform opened fire on Friday at a youth camp outside Oslo.
It's just, you don't think this is going to happen in northern parts of Europe, really. It's something you just see about in the TV, and that's really shocking.
On July 22, 2011, Norway saw anger over immigration turn deadly. In recent years, immigration in Norway has become a major issue, thanks in large part to the growth of its Muslim population. The issue came to a deadly head in July when Anders Behring Breivik, the man behind the massacre, claimed the government's failure to curb the Islamic immigration tide was a major reason for his attack on the innocent.
Europe has to fight very strongly any kind of racism in the future. I think there's time now that the democratic forces of Europe stand up and say really strongly, fight the beginning, fight the Nazis, fight this right-wing extremism.
Sadly, despite his age, Adnan has already seen the effects of the world's growing population firsthand. The 6 billionth living human hasn't experienced the hatred caused by immigration firsthand, but his life has been plagued with population-based problems. Life was good for Adnan and his family, who live in a small town in central Bosnia, until Adnan's father was diagnosed with cancer. Like many people who live on a fixed income, paying for medical expenses has become a major burden.
I used to have a job, but suddenly I got sick and had to retire. We now have to live on my retirement benefit, about 160 euros a month.
According to the World Health Organization, some 1 billion people today lack access to adequate health care. To change that, Adnan wants to become a doctor when he grows up. But in the meantime, countless people around the world are still left struggling to survive. People like 15-year-old Juliet Achieng in Kenya. Juliet was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma 3 years ago. Her Aunt Teresa, who has taken care of her since her mother died of meningitis, says it's nearly impossible to afford the treatments.
It is very expensive. And moreover, at such a time when the cost of living is very, very high. It is very, very hard, very expensive on me.
This is not new either, because we are seeing that in Africa, but we have seen that before in Asia and in India, in China, or we have seen that also in South America.
Despite setbacks, people around the world are now living longer than ever before, thanks to advancements in healthcare. There are still some extreme exceptions like Swaziland, where people on average only live to be 40 years old. But internationally, life expectancy has now reached 67 years, according to the United Nations, and people in developed countries are living much longer than that. For example, the average person in Japan lives to be 83. Living longer should be good news, but as our population grows, so does the number of elderly. As of 2009, the world's 65 and older population was 516 million. By 2050, the international elderly population is expected to triple to 1.53 billion,